Imagine being so hated by your successor that dying wasn't enough to escape punishment. In the year 897, a dead pope was ripped from his grave, dressed in his papal robes, propped up on a throne, and forced to stand trial for crimes against the church. A living, breathing deacon was assigned to speak on behalf of the rotting corpse, while the current pope screamed accusations at a body that had been decomposing for nearly 9 months. And somehow, that's not even the wildest part of the story. This is the Cadaver Synod, and it is hands down the most deranged event in the history of the Catholic Church. And yes, that is a very competitive category. To understand how we got to the point of literally putting a dead man on trial, we need to rewind a bit and talk about what was happening in Europe during the late 800s. This was not a good time to be pope. The papacy in the 9th century was essentially a political football being kicked around by powerful Italian families, Carolingian kings, and anyone else with enough soldiers and ambition to meddle in church affairs. Popes were being installed, deposed, imprisoned, and murdered at a rate that would make a Game of Thrones writer blush. Into this chaos stepped a man named Formosus. Now, Formosus had actually been a pretty accomplished church figure for decades before he ever wore the big hat. He served as the Bishop of Porto, which was an important diocese near Rome, and he was sent on major diplomatic missions, including one to Bulgaria, where he was so beloved that the Bulgarian king specifically requested he stay on as their archbishop. That request, by the way, would come back to haunt him in ways nobody could have predicted. Formosus was talented, ambitious, and politically savvy, which in 9th century Rome meant he made a lot of very powerful enemies. In 876, Pope John VIII accused Formosus of conspiracy, stripped him of his offices, and excommunicated him. Formosus was forced to flee Rome and spent years in exile, swearing oaths that he would never return to the city or seek to exercise his priestly functions again. But politics being politics, the winds shifted. A new pope restored him, and against all odds, Formosus clawed his way back. In 891, he was elected pope himself, and for a while, things actually went reasonably well. As pope, Formosus inherited a nightmarish political landscape. The big issue of the day was who would be crowned Holy Roman Emperor, which was essentially a question of which strongman got to claim divine backing for their power. Formosus initially crowned a man named Guy III of Spoleto as emperor, but Guy was more of a regional thug than a unifying leader, and Formosus quickly grew disillusioned. So he did something incredibly bold and incredibly dangerous. He secretly invited Arnulf of Carinthia, the king of the East Franks, to march on Rome and take the imperial crown instead. Arnulf did exactly that. He rolled into Italy with an army, and in 896, Formosus crowned him Holy Roman Emperor, effectively double-crossing the Spoleto dynasty. This was a massive political betrayal, and the Spoleto family and their allies were absolutely furious. But before the full consequences of this move could play out, two things happened in quick succession. Arnulf suffered a stroke and had to retreat back north, leaving Formosus without his military protector. And then, in April of 896, Formosus himself died. Natural causes, as far as anyone can tell. He was around 80 years old and had lived an exhausting life. You might think death would be the end of the story. You would be very, very wrong. After Formosus died, the papacy changed hands with dizzying speed. His immediate successor, Boniface VI, lasted only 15 days before dying himself, possibly of gout, possibly of something more sinister. And then came the man who would orchestrate one of history's most grotesque spectacles. Pope Stephen VI, sometimes numbered as Stephen VII, depending on which historical list you use. Stephen was a puppet of the Spoleto faction, specifically of Lambert of Spoleto and his mother Agiltrude, who were still seething over Formosus's betrayal. Whether Stephen was acting on their orders, pursuing his own vendetta, or had simply lost his mind is something historians still debate. What is not debated is what he did next. In January of 897, Stephen ordered that the body of Pope Formosus be exhumed from its tomb in St. Peter's Basilica. The corpse, which had been buried for roughly 9 months, was dragged out of the ground, dressed in full papal vestments, and seated on a throne in the Basilica of St. John Lateran. A formal ecclesiastical trial was convened. Cardinals, bishops, and clergy filled the room, and there, at the center of it all, sat the decomposing remains of a dead pope, propped up like some kind of macabre puppet. A teenage deacon was appointed to stand behind the corpse and answer the charges on Formosus's behalf. Imagine being that kid. You're maybe 17 years old, standing behind a rotting body, expected to defend it, while the current pope is red-faced and screaming accusations from across the room. The charges against Formosus included perjury, violating canon law by moving from one bishopric to another, and serving as pope while technically still being the Bishop of Porto. Stephen reportedly addressed the corpse directly, shouting at it, demanding answers, treating the trial as though his predecessor might suddenly sit up and defend himself. The outcome was, unsurprisingly, a foregone conclusion. Formosus was found guilty on all counts. His papacy was declared illegitimate. Every ordination he had ever performed, every decree he had ever signed, was retroactively annulled, which threw the entire church hierarchy into chaos because a huge number of sitting bishops and priests had been ordained by Formosus. Then came the physical punishment. The 3 fingers on Formosus's right hand, the fingers used to bestow papal blessings, were hacked off. His papal vestments were torn from the body. And then the corpse was dragged through the streets of Rome and hurled into the Tiber River like garbage. Let that sink in. The highest authority in Western Christendom was dragged from his grave, publicly humiliated, mutilated, and thrown into a river by his own successor, in the name of God. Now here's where things get even more chaotic, if you can believe it. The public reaction to the Cadaver Synod was not what Stephen had hoped for. Rather than cementing his authority and discrediting Formosus forever, the trial disgusted the people of Rome. Word of the grotesque spectacle spread, and public opinion turned sharply against Stephen. There were also reports that an earthquake struck the Lateran Basilica shortly after the trial, damaging the building severely. Whether you see that as divine judgment or unfortunate coincidence, the symbolism was not lost on the Roman populace. Meanwhile, Formosus's body was fished out of the Tiber by a monk, and rumors began circulating that the dead pope's remains were performing miracles. His body was quietly hidden away, while Rome descended into political turmoil. As for Stephen VI, his reign did not last long. Within months of the Cadaver Synod, a faction opposed to him rose up, seized him, stripped him of his papal vestments in a bitter echo of what he had done to Formosus, and threw him into prison and strangled him to death in his cell in the summer of 897. He had been pope for barely over a year. The popes who followed tried to sort out the mess. Pope Theodore II, who reigned for only 20 days, immediately annulled the Cadaver Synod and ordered Formosus's body recovered and reburied in St. Peter's with full papal honours. Later, Pope John IX held a synod that formally condemned the entire trial and prohibited any future trials of dead persons. You know your institution has gone off the rails when you have to formally pass a rule saying you cannot prosecute corpses. But even that wasn't the end of it. A later pope, Sergius III, who was a vicious political operator in his own right, reversed course again, reaffirmed the guilty verdict against Formosus, and reportedly had the body exhumed a second time and beheaded. The poor man could not catch a break, even in death. The Cadaver Synod is often treated as a bizarre historical footnote, a quirky anecdote you might find in a trivia book. But it actually tells us something profound about the nature of power, institutions, and human pettiness. This was the most powerful religious institution in the Western world at the time, and it allowed a sitting pope to put a dead body on trial because of political grudges and factional warfare. It reveals just how thoroughly politics had consumed the church during this period, and how the papacy, supposedly the spiritual heart of Christianity, had become a prize to be fought over by warlords and aristocratic families. It also shows us something about the power of spectacle and symbol. Stephen didn't just want Formosus declared guilty. He needed to physically destroy his predecessor, to erase him from the record, to make his body suffer the way a living criminal would. It was an act of total domination, an attempt to reach beyond death itself to punish an enemy. And in the end, it backfired spectacularly, because the Roman people saw it for what it was, not justice, but madness. The Cadaver Synod stands as one of those moments in history that reminds us institutions are only as stable as the people running them. And sometimes the people running them are absolutely unhinged. So there you have it. A dead pope, a rigged trial, a mutilated corpse tossed in a river, and a chain of revenge that left multiple popes dead in its wake. The 9th century papacy was wild, and honestly, there are dozens more stories from this era that are almost as insane. If you want me to cover more of them, let me know in the comments. Which part of this story shocked you the most? Was it the trial itself, the earthquake, or the fact that they dug up this poor man more than once? Drop your thoughts below. If you enjoyed this video, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and hit that notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into history's most unbelievable true stories. I'll see you in the next one.